Hi, thank you very much for joining our session today. I'm Matthew Shanahan, and I'll be sharing with you the key findings from our 2022 Mobile Gender Gap Report. Now, the Mobile Gender Gap Report series is an annual report that we've been publishing for the last 5 years, enabling us to comment on trends in the gender gap from across low and middle income countries. The findings in our latest report are drawn from the GSMA Consumer Survey, supplemented by other third-party data and qualitative research that we conducted in India and Kenya, highlighting the impact of COVID-19 on mobile use by women. The survey was conducted face-to-face in 10 low and middle-income countries at the end of 2021, and the survey gathered critical data on the mobile gender gap and allows us to continue monitoring the impact of the pandemic on women's access to and use of mobile. In this presentation, I'll be sharing with you some of the key findings. Here we see how the mobile internet gender gap has changed over the years, including our latest estimate for 2021. We've been tracking the mobile internet gender gap across low and middle income countries since 2017, when it was estimated to be 25%. What this means is that women were 25% less likely than men to use mobile internet. And this gender gap percentage dropped every year through to 2020, where it dropped as low as 15%. And this was good news. However, our latest estimate for 2021 suggested this progress has stalled, with the gender gap in mobile internet use now at 16%. This is the first time GSMA data has recorded this type of negative trend. Last year, we'd seen some early warning signs that things might be getting worse. For example, our qualitative research in Kenya revealed that the economic impact of COVID-19 had been severe, affecting the affordability of mobile and lowering the justification for some women to use the internet. This data is a clear call to action. Progress in closing the mobile internet gender gap has stalled overall across LMICs and even reversed in some countries. Now, we look at the underlying numbers to better understand what is going on. From 2018 to 2020, we can see that more women than men started using mobile internet each year. However, in 2021, the number of additional women almost halved from 110 million in 2020 to 59 million in 2021. Meanwhile, the number of men adopting mobile internet increased more than women in 2021. The widening gender gap we saw on the last slide is not due to women going offline, rather their adoption stalling compared to men. And this is where we are now. Across low and middle income countries, women are now 16% less likely than men to use mobile internet. For context, 60% of women now use mobile internet compared to 71% of men. The gender gap in mobile internet use varies across regions, with the widest gaps in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. There's actually been no notable change in regional gender gaps over the years, except in South Asia, where consistent progress had been driving an overall reduction in the gender gap across LMICs. In 2020, for the first time, the gender gap in mobile internet use in South Asia was on par with Sub-Saharan Africa. However, from 2020 to 2021, mobile internet adoption among men in South Asia continued to increase, while adoption among women plateaued. This has resulted in the mobile internet gender gap in South Asia widening from 36% to 41%. It's worth noting here that India has been a big driver of the closing gender gap over the years, but saw no material increase in the proportion of women adopting mobile internet in the last year, while an increasing proportion of men were adopting mobile internet. In last year's report, we highlighted the remarkable growth in Indian women's mobile internet use. Changing market dynamics over the past few years have made the internet more affordable and, combined with COVID-19 restrictions and lockdowns that drove more women online, had helped to narrow the mobile internet gender gap. In contrast, the proportion of Indian women using mobile internet has remained at 30% this year, whereas the proportion of Indian men using mobile internet has grown to 50%. Now, this is a significant change for a country that had been decisively reducing the mobile gender gap. And it's not only affected India's mobile internet gender gap, but also widened the overall gender gap in South Asia and across LMICs. Despite an initial sharp increase in mobile internet adoption in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, women's mobile internet use appears to have plateaued as the pandemic has progressed and livelihoods have suffered, and to a much greater extent than men. These nuances highlight the complexity underpinning country-level gender gaps. Now, we look at smartphone ownership. We know that smartphones are critical to accessing the internet and reducing the gender gap. Once women own a smartphone, their awareness and use of mobile internet is almost on par with men. Unfortunately, this year, the smartphone ownership story is also not so positive. While the gender gap in smartphone ownership dropped from 21% in 2019 to 16% in 2020, it has widened back out to 18% in 2021, mirroring the stalling progress in closing the mobile internet gender gap. Now, if we want to close these gender gaps, we need to understand what is preventing women from owning a mobile phone all the way through to using mobile internet regularly and accessing its full potential. We use a simple framework to understand this mobile internet user journey, and the gender gap tends to widen at each stage in this journey. So, the gender gap for mobile ownership across LMICs is 7%, where it has continued to remain largely flat, highlighting that those who still do not have a mobile phone are proving difficult to reach. But it is also important to look at what type of handset people own. Women still typically own more basic handsets than men and are 18% less likely than men to own a smartphone. Now, moving on to awareness of mobile internet, following strong growth in both men's and women's mobile internet awareness from 2017 to 2019, awareness levels are still relatively high in most of the survey countries, but growth has slowed, even in countries where awareness remains relatively low, such as India and Bangladesh. In all 10 survey countries, women are still less likely than men to be aware of mobile internet. Awareness remains a significant initial barrier to mobile internet adoption, particularly in India, where half of women are still unaware of mobile internet. In half of the countries surveyed, more than a quarter of all women are still not aware of mobile internet, and by extension, the benefits it could bring to their lives. Despite rising awareness among women, the mobile internet gender gap is still high at 16%, suggesting there are other key barriers stopping women from adopting it. In fact, the mobile internet gender gap is more than double the mobile ownership gender gap. Finally, moving on to regular use of mobile internet, promoting equal uptake of mobile internet is not sufficient to meaningfully close the gender gap. Equal use is just as critical to ensure that women can reap the full benefits of all the services and opportunities that mobile internet has to offer. Overall, both men and women continue to use their phones for a wider range of activities in most of the survey countries, but there is a persistent gender gap. Women tend to use their mobile phones for a narrower range of activities than men on a weekly basis, and it will likely come as no surprise that owning a smartphone substantially increases diversity of use for both men and women. Looking specifically now at the top reported barriers to mobile ownership and mobile internet use, across survey countries, the top barriers that men and women said were preventing them from owning a phone are still very similar, with little change since 2019. These barriers are affordability, specifically of handsets, literacy and digital skills, and safety and security. However, there are variations in the top reported barriers at country level. Our research found that once women are using a mobile phone and are aware of mobile internet, the top barriers preventing them from adopting mobile internet are a lack of literacy and digital skills, affordability, primarily of internet-enabled handsets, and safety and security. These overall rankings have not changed despite the evolving landscape of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are the same barriers for men, but we also see that these barriers disproportionately impact women. And women tend to belong to the groups that are most likely to be unconnected, such as those who are unemployed or have low literacy levels, and are also often affected by social norms, which make mobile ownership and use more difficult. Among low-income groups, there is evidence that the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has made handsets and mobile internet even less affordable and affected access to smartphones and mobile internet use. Social norms also continue to play an important role. This year, the survey uncovered further information around how these social norms play out with regard to handset acquisition. Across the survey countries, women were less likely than men to have chosen their model of mobile phone, even when they paid for it themselves. Respondents in our qualitative research in Kenya highlighted that the ability to afford a smartphone and data has diminished due to lower incomes, with women disproportionately impacted. Most mobile internet users in Kenya described how, to make ends meet, they had cut their internet use substantially over the course of the pandemic. Although a minority had upgraded to a smartphone, others had downgraded, selling smartphones for cash or being unable to replace lost or broken ones. Women were expected to prioritize other needs first. Now, 4 key points that we'd like to leave you with today are that first, progress in closing the mobile internet gender gap has stalled, with fewer women adopting mobile internet than men. Concerted efforts are needed to avoid it widening. Second, progress in reducing the gender gap in smartphone ownership has stalled, despite smartphones being critical to digital inclusion for women. Third, men and women are using their mobile phones for a wider range of activities in most survey countries, but there is a persistent gender gap. And finally, affordability, particularly handset affordability, and literacy and digital skills remain key barriers. So, what can stakeholders do to address the mobile gender gap? Our full report provides more specific recommendations for different stakeholders, but here we share 4 high-level actions to consider. Ensure that there is a focus on gender equality and reaching women at an organizational and policy level through senior leaders championing the issue and setting specific gender equity targets. We believe it's crucial for stakeholders to understand the mobile gender gap. This can be done by improving the quality and availability of gender disaggregated data, and by understanding women's needs and the barriers that prevent them from owning and using mobile technology. Unfortunately, this data is currently lacking. Gender disaggregated data is crucial for measuring the gender gap, and it is critical for setting targets and developing strategies, policies, and commercial approaches to address the mobile gender gap and to keep tracking our progress. When it comes to designing and implementing mobile-related products, services, and policies, stakeholders should ensure that women's needs, circumstances, and challenges are explicitly addressed. This includes addressing the key barriers faced by women, as well as consideration of social norms that can contribute to women experiencing these barriers more acutely than men. For example, when it comes to the top 2 barriers mentioned earlier, affordability can be improved by supporting industry to lower the upfront costs of mobile handsets, particularly internet-enabled handsets, which would disproportionately benefit women. And on literacy and skills, invest in education and mobile skills training specifically for women and girls that increases their digital literacy and confidence levels. If stakeholders don't proactively take women's needs and the barriers they face into consideration, they may inadvertently reinforce the mobile gender gap. Finally, collaborate and partner with different stakeholders to address the mobile gender gap. Targeted intervention is needed from industry, policymakers, the development community, and other stakeholders to ensure that women are no longer left behind. COVID-19 has shown us the importance of tracking digital inclusion. Now, more than ever, it is critical that we continue to monitor the impact of the pandemic on the gender gap and use this data to ensure the digital inclusion of women for a better future. Closing the mobile gender gap presents social, commercial, and economic opportunities, and it will ensure that women are not further excluded from an increasingly digital society. Conducting face-to-face research helps us monitor the ever-evolving gender equality and digital inclusion landscape, which, as we have seen this year, is more critical than ever. Thank you for listening.